Where do you think in the United States has the most expensive Uber rides? I'll give you a second. They just did a huge study, a bunch of statistics to figure this out. Did not expect this one city, I'll be honest. Ready? 3, 2, put in your guesses now. 1, boom. Seattle. Gotta be honest, if you gave me 10, 20, 30 guesses, Seattle would have not popped up on my list. So let's go down here. As you can see, the most expensive average Uber ride in the country is in Seattle, where a 30-minute ride costs an average of $60. That's ridiculous. According to a study by Net Credit, the price of Uber rides increased by approximately 7% nationwide last year. I feel like that's higher, at least for me in LA. Uber rides are significantly more expensive, and that's a big thing, right? In addition to the rising prices, customers have cited the company's surge pricing method, a pricing practice that increases fares. We all know this, what surge pricing is. They increase the fares during periods of high demand and limited driver availability as a reason to seek alternative transportation options. A lot of people are now avoiding Uber and Lyft because they're like, it's too expensive. And this is why, if you look at Waymo, for example, which we'll talk about a bit later in this video, people are choosing Waymo in some ways. We'll talk about that a bit later, though. And here's the thing. It's making people miserable to not know what things cost, which is partly true, partly false. Like, as we all know, Uber and Lyft has upfront pricing that's dynamic. I think it's one of the first companies to really do that, where they're like, hey, you don't know what you're gonna pay yet, but we're gonna at least tell you it before you pay, if that makes sense, right? But as we all know, for that same ride you take all the time, whether it's to work, whether it's to a bar, whether it's to a friend's place, that ride might be $15, it could be $23, it could be $27, it could be $12, and sometimes you don't know until you pull up the app. And if you're out, let's say at a bar doing the right thing, you don't want to be driving, you want to be responsible. If, let's say, you don't have a car, so you need to take it to work, sometimes you are at the mercy of the surge pricing, as right here. As Bilal said, the director of policy and research at Groundwork Collective, told NetCredit, we live in an age where budgeting is really essential to get by amid a really long-term affordability crisis in the country, and that's true. NetCredit compiled the study after quoting the average local price estimate of Uber in the 100 most populated cities in the United States, and then they did that to find the local average price of a 30-minute ride. This is where it gets interesting. Fort Worth, Texas, which is kind of interesting, and Indianapolis have the cheapest Uber rides, averaging $28.33 for a 30-minute ride, which is half the cost, actually more than half the cost of a 30-minute ride in Seattle. The other cities that make this trip, let me pause this, the cheapest rides are Tucson, Mesa, Miami, surprising, Oklahoma. Miami was surprising. Miami was pretty cheap when I was there, I'll be honest. Oklahoma City, et cetera, et cetera. The biggest thing is the affordability in Indianapolis is in the competition. InDrive, which I've never heard of before, by the way, is a rideshare app where the customer proposes a price and it's up to the driver to accept it or counter bid or do a counter offer. Kind of interesting. Now here's what's kind of interesting to me as well. The 10 most expensive cities for an Uber ride. Places like Reno, New York, San Diego. I could see San Diego. Anchorage. I've heard that Alaska is expensive in general. San Jose, Portland. Surprised LA's not on that list because rides in LA can be pretty pricey, but, kind of crazy. And you can see here that an Uber ride in Washington as a state overall costs 185.6% more compared to the hourly median wage. And that is a big thing, I'll be honest, a lot of people are getting annoyed with when they're like, wait a minute, I'm spending so much money to take an Uber ride or a Lyft ride. And obviously, this is about Uber specifically, but I feel like this goes hand in hand with Uber versus Lyft, tomato in a sense. I'll talk about that in a second. But this is kind of crazy, right? Things are getting way more expensive. And I just did a video a couple weeks ago that they did a whole study, and they found that Uber and Lyft fares of what you're spending as a passenger is going up. Yet what drivers are making is going down. And this has been a recurring theme. I've talked about this in so many videos on this channel. Kind of ridiculous. Now, when we talk about Uber and Lyft and then add into Waymo, what's interesting is Obi did a study. I talked about this in a few videos already. Obi did a study, which tracks pricing as well, about Uber versus Lyft versus Waymo in terms of pricing. They found that typically Uber is more expensive than Lyft. So in this case, if let's say you are in Seattle, you're probably going to take a Lyft. And this is what most people do. They pull up Uber, they pull up Lyft, whichever one's cheapest, they take that one. So statistically speaking, it is going to be your best bet, not always, but typically, to take a Lyft as opposed to an Uber, even to get the cheapest rideshare possible. And let's be honest, the experience, if I word it like that, of taking an Uber versus a Lyft, the exact same. But then you have the curveball of Waymo, and Waymo has been a big reoccurring thing on this channel. I created a whole playlist about all my Waymo videos. I've done tutorials about Waymo now. I've done news updates because it's undeniable. You know, Waymo, in case you don't know, is a self-driving car with an app similar to Uber and Lyft where you can order it, but it does everything on its own. You have the entire car to yourself. It's in places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Phoenix, now Atlanta, Austin, soon to potentially be in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York. The list goes on. It's spreading rapidly. And what's kind of crazy is, as you mentioned briefly in this article, there are a lot of people saying, okay, I need to find an alternative to Uber and Lyft. And let me find another one, whether it's InDrive, which I haven't heard about before. There's other ones popping up. Rides is one that's been popping up. Empower, I did a video about them. That's in like the DC area. So there's different rideshare apps popping up around the country. The tricky thing though about making a new one, there's been a question I have gotten a lot is, if you think about it, those two things need to happen instantaneously. You need to have the driver on the road at the exact same time a passenger orders that Lyft, Uber, in this case, that other rideshare company, right? It's not like Gatorade where Gatorade could make Gatorade, put it on the shelves, and I don't know what the expiration date is, but let's say Gatorade expires a year once you bottle it, for example. Well, that can be on the shelf for 6-8 months until the consumer grabs it and goes and buys it. With ride sharing, those two things need to happen at the exact same time. And I think that's what makes creating a new rideshare app very, very difficult. You're talking, in my opinion, about having to do a lot of marketing, a lot of outreach, a lot of word of mouth, a lot of just having people to download the app and use it, but then also having a lot of drivers to be like, hey, I'm willing to not drive for an Uber to drive your app. It is brutally difficult to make one. But the one company that is right now is Waymo, and they're making waves with this. And what's interesting is talking about Obi, like I mentioned in a few videos as well. When I look at Uber versus Lyft and now versus Waymo, Waymo is statistically speaking more expensive than Uber and then more expensive than Lyft. Even though that's the case, even though Waymo is more expensive than both Uber and Lyft, statistically speaking, more people are choosing a Waymo now and willing to spend the upcharge. I have a couple of theories about this. I think one, these are tech-heavy type cities that are, I'm not gonna lie, people have money. So to them, spending a $5 or $10 extra to be in a Waymo versus an Uber and Lyft, they're like, it's $5 or $10. That's nothing to me. Sometimes even more expensive is $20. Tough to say. Especially if you look at like LA and San Fran, people have money. But I think the second thing is the privacy. You have the Waymo to yourself. If, like, say you wake up and you're like, hey, this happened to one of my friends. I know this past weekend, actually. She was not feeling the best after a crazy night out. And she goes, hey, I'm not going to lie, I have anxiety. And she was like, I'm going to get a Waymo to go home. I just don't want to be around people right now. I need to go home and lie down, take a nap, maybe get some pho or something like that, And so that's a big advantage of Waymos. And as people are starting to look for other transportation options, I think people are saying, like, look, Uber and Lyft are getting way too expensive. It's getting way too expensive to take an Uber and Lyft. And for what? For the same ride I take all the time. But with a Waymo, at least it's kind of cool. It's futuristic. I have the whole thing to myself, et cetera, et cetera. And a bit of a side tangent on this video, but it is something that's becoming alarming where people are saying, look, I'm spending way too much. $60 for a 30-minute ride in Seattle is crazy. And I'm kind of curious as to why Seattle. Honestly, out of all places, it is kind of weird. I mean, I know it rains a lot. I know when I used to drive in Boston, the weather was definitely a big factor, that when it would snow especially and everything, I'd make a ton of money. Maybe it's because of that. I don't know. Maybe it's just one of the weird things about Seattle. Because again, if they said LA, I would have been like, I get that. If they said like San Diego being one of the most expensive places to take an Uber and Lyft, I remember that. When I went to San Diego, when I visited friends there, because it's only like a 2 to 3 hour drive from LA. Yeah, I remember that. But Seattle, kind of weird. But again, it is becoming this issue. People right now are starting to become really fed up with the pricing of Uber and Lyft, where they're like, hey, even if you don't live in Seattle, it's just getting too expensive. It's too expensive to take it. They're looking for other options. People are looking for other alternatives, and not even just for passengers, but for drivers as well. Where drivers have been saying for years, shouting it from the rooftops, as I have done on a lot of my videos. We're like, hey, people are spending more money for Ubers and Lyfts. People are getting fed up with this pricing, and we're making less. As drivers, we're making less, and all Uber and Lyft is doing is just pocketing it for themselves. Super annoying, super frustrating, and it seemed like it's only getting worse.